Good morning, guys. This is Scott Tarpley. Today we're going to continue our talks on how to dry commercial building materials and some of the different materials that are in commercial buildings that you don't always run into in a residential setting, and that's why commercial buildings can be a different animal than just drying a residential building. A lot of people, and I think I've said this in the last series, a lot of people say, well, if I can dry 1,000 square foot house and I can dry 100 of those a year, I can dry 100,000 square foot commercial building. And there's a lot of difference in the two that you need to be aware of, and that's what we want to do, is bring some awareness to that. Today we'll conclude the series, at least for the short time, on drying different building materials. I know it's a little bit more of the boring part, but I think it has some good content and good information in it. We're going to talk a good bit about flooring today because there's so many different types of flooring in commercial buildings that you may or may not see in most residential buildings. There's tons of different flooring. Used to be pretty cut and dry, and you're either going to have tile, concrete, or carpet in a commercial building, but now they've started decorating them with marble and a lot of different types of floor systems. So we want to talk about a lot of the different floor systems that are used these days to make commercial buildings pretty and to make them to where they're soundproof, and to make them in a lot of different other ways more appealing to the commercial client. But they don't design these floors to be dried. They're designed not to be wet. So that's one of the things we have to figure out as we're going through and drying. Of course, hardwood in a commercial setting is always one of the things that we see a lot of. The difference is on the hardwoods, you don't know what's under it in a commercial building. Now, as this picture will show, there's a lot of people who are renovating these real old commercial buildings in the downtown districts and here and there, and you see the brick wall with the patched up window in it, and used to people would put sheetrock over the top of that. Keep that in mind too as you're drying. You might run into one of those that does have sheetrock on top of it, and they laminate it to it, and it's a big word for glue, but most of the time when you glue sheetrock to a wall like that, you simply use sheetrock mud. You put big daubs of mud on the sheetrock, you put the sheetrock up there, and then you press on it, and then you'll take a board and a hammer and sort of beat on the board and make sure the glue smushes into the cracks of the brick or the wall you're putting on. They call that laminating. So a lot of times you may see the lamination of sheetrock on top of a brick wall like that. You can't dry anything if you don't know what you're drying. Just keep that in mind, that you have to know what you're drying. So make sure you have to do a little bit of inspections here and there, and sometimes you may have to drill a hole, maybe below the baseboard line or in an inconspicuous spot, or maybe if you've got some sheetrock tape peeling off because of the water or something like that, you pick a spot like that so you're not doing additional damage to it. So when you get into these older buildings, you don't know what's under that floor. It may be an original floor, or it may be one that's been added in to make it look original. I've seen floors put in that people actually bring horses inside the commercial building with horseshoes on to have the horses walk around on the floor to put dents in it, and sometimes a horseshoe print or the back of it, but they want to make that floor have some ambiance. I've seen commercial buildings with soft pine floors in it, again with the idea of letting the floor get dented up and looking old and having character to it. A lot of different drying than it is from drying oak flooring that you see in most homes. A little bit of difference in some of the flooring material here on this slide Typically in a house, you're going to have most of the time 2¼ to 3¼ inch flooring, but it can go all the way up. Excuse me, all the way up to 6 inches in the flooring, and even some custom floors, maybe even a little bit wider. The thing this picture is not showing you is the thickness of the floor. Is that when you're looking at a wood floor, most of you in this group are going to know the difference between hardwood and a laminate. But you could have a laminate floor, and laminate floors are not always 1/4 inch like they used to be. They're putting laminate now on regular thickness wood. They're also putting it on composite material. A lot of that sometimes is sold as being waterproof. And the flooring itself may in fact be waterproof. You may see it in a store advertised soaking in a glass of water or a fish tank full of water. And the flooring may be waterproof. Our challenge is not in drying the flooring at that point. It's between it's about drying the water that's under the floor. However, if that laminate material is not on a waterproof material with waterproof glue, that laminate will start to separate, and once that happens, that floor is pretty much toast where it's laminating at and would need replacement. Now, the next thing you have to worry about is what is that floor on top of in a commercial building. I've seen some, and it brings to mind a job in Louisville, Kentucky. I helped someone with 7 layers of floors in this 120-year-old building. 7 layers. Now, there was a company that was hired to come in and dry this building, and they attempted to dry it for 21 days, and they just sort of threw their hands up and quit because they couldn't get it dry. And then another company was hired, and they had called me to come in and do some consulting and help them out with it. And nobody knew what we were drying. In that particular case, we had another hardwood floor under the exposed hardwood. We had a layer of sheet vinyl floor covering. Under that, we had a layer of asbestos floor tile. Under that, we had a layer of 1/2 inch plywood. And under that, we had the 3/4 inch 1x6 or 1x8 tongue and groove flooring, subflooring that was put down for the structure of the original building. The building had been wet a while, and all 7 layers were wet. So, how do you dry that? The question is, the answer is destructive drying. You have to tear a certain amount of that out. Keeping in mind asbestos, a lot of the flooring that you'll deal with has asbestos. A lot of the flooring does not, but the mastic or the glue that's holding the flooring on does have asbestos in it. So you've got to watch that asbestos when you're doing flooring. It's one of the places that you will find more asbestos in the building than pretty much anywhere else. Pretty predominant. You look to the right on the screen at the right top, it may be on concrete. Now, on top of that concrete, you may have some type of underlayment. It's typical to put a foam layer in there that gives the floor a quieter sound when you walk on it. When people with heels walk across it, you don't hear the click, 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 click. So they'll put foam under there or some kind of deadening board, and then that can be set on concrete. That can also be set on lightweight concrete, or what's also referred to as gypcrete. Gypcrete is a material that is pretty light. It's got a lot of vermiculite or zonelite in it. They pour it similar to concrete, normally poured after the building is well underway in construction and getting ready for floor covering, but it is an excellent sound deadening material and used in most hotels that have multiple stories in it. The problem with gypcrete is it has a lot of air mixed into it, and that's what helps make it light, but it holds water like a sponge really well. It's a little difficult to dry. It's hard to get water to come out of it. It can be dried. The cost of taking it out is enormous. So when you have a flooring system on top of gypcrete or lightweight concrete, sometimes you have to take the top layer of the floor out to get to the surface to dry it, and then a lot of times you have to dry it from top and bottom. Now if you have lightweight concrete, where this picture up here top right says concrete, they had to pour that lightweight concrete onto something. That could be metal, which makes your challenge considerably worse. Most of the time, though, it's on 1/2-inch plywood. In a good building, maybe 3/4-inch tongue and groove plywood. But that wood is going to be wet as well. So sometimes you have to dry that from the top and from the bottom. If that floor was imported from Spain or Italy and cost $1 billion, they might not want to take that floor out to try to get that dry. You're just looking at extended drying days. I've been on some as long as 45 days to get them dry. And say, oh, it's cheaper to tear it out. Well, in a house, you're correct. It gets back to the 1,000 house syndrome. In a house, it's probably just cheaper to tear it out and put another room of lightweight concrete in and another room of floor covering. But in a commercial building, this floor covering same type of wood and floor covering on the surface may extend throughout the entire commercial building. And they may not want a different floor covering in this end of the building as they have in the rest of the building that didn't get affected. In fact, their contract with particularly hotel chains are bad about this. This contract would not allow that, to where in a homeowner's they'd say, well, I can put a different color or different pattern, or it's going to look newer in this area of the house than it does that area. That'd be okay. Well, in the commercial industry, a lot of your hotel chains and a lot of your chain stores do not allow that. It has to be the same throughout. So sometimes you may get stuck drying that floor, which is a good thing if you know how to dry it. But you've got to know what you're drying when you get into that. When you talk about tearing it out, most contractors, believe it or not, will put the lightweight concrete or the gypcrete in after the sheetrock is put on the walls. That's done because your studs are pre-cut to put 8-foot or 9-foot sheetrock panels in. And if you put the lightweight concrete in first, then the pre-cut panels don't fit. So they get in there and they put the drywall up first. It also keeps the lightweight concrete from going over the seal plate when they're pouring it, so it sort of acts as a form for it. Now the challenge that poses for you, it also creates a little 1/2-inch or 5/8, on commercial, 5/8-inch trough around the floor between the lightweight and the wood stud. And that trough is full of water and soppy wet sheetrock, and that has to be dug out. Now when you go to digging that out, in a lot of cases, and you'll want to give people a reason, not an excuse as to why this happens. Remember, I've said before, reasons when you tell somebody before it occurs, and excuses when you tell somebody after the fact. So you need to give them a reason, but when you go to trying to take screwdrivers and dig out that little 5/8-inch strip of sheetrock that's 1.5 inches deep buried into this concrete, a lot of times you're going to chip that concrete up, that lightweight concrete. It does not have a ton of strength to it. It's designed to lay on the floor, and it's designed to have a floor covering put on it and then walked on, but it's not designed to have a lot of strength to it. So when you start chipping that up, there's a huge industry argument about whether or not you can patch it and have the same quality there or not. And a lot of people say no. So a lot of people say once you start chipping it up, it has to come out. Now, you're talking major repairs to take all that lightweight concrete out and to then remove the bottom section of sheetrock where it got wet and to put all that back and then re-pour that. You're talking a dusty mess from doing the pouring of the concrete, total furniture removal, major job. So you need to be explaining that up front before you start saying, well, it'd just be easier to tear it out. One other thing that this picture don't show, but in a lot of the lightweight concrete, particularly when you get into your colder areas in the north and in the northwest. They'll have a hydronic heating system inside the lightweight concrete. So what they do is they put the plywood down, they put plastic tubes that runs hot water, which will usually use glycol in it so it don't freeze, but it circulates and runs through these tubes and it heats the floor, and that radiant heat from the floor makes the building warm. So that's how they heat the building. So you start putting a hammer probe into the lightweight concrete and hit one of those tubes, and you've got another water damage and a patch job to do on it. A lot of challenges with that, as you can see, just talking about hardwood floors and what they might be on. The bottom right corner is showing a floor. It's a little more typical, but it will be laid on either engineered wood flooring, or it can be laid on a solid flooring, one or the other. Or this, actually, the one on the left is a laminate hard surface floor that they'll claim can't dent, can't scratch, and is waterproof, but then it's on a engineered wood floor that most of the time will come apart when it gets wet. A typical basketball floor will have 2 or 3 layers of plywood under it laid in opposite directions, so it holds up the pressure of the ball being bounced and that kind of stuff. So you may have a 4 or 5 inch thick floor to dry on a gymnasium. So we'll talk about gyms here in a little bit. Hard to dry any kind of plywood without a matte drying system. These systems are the best that I've seen in the industry as far as being able to get areas of hardwood dry and to pull air through the cracks in the hardwood. These are commercially available. They're also available to rent, although they're hard to find. But either way, it's going to take a few days to get those in. These big gym floors, skating rinks, bowling alleys, it's not going to be something you're going to up and dry in 3 days. So you need to get that notion out of anybody's head that's got this 3-day drying myth in their head when it comes to these floors. They're just designed and engineered totally different. Here's a floor where they've done some attempt at tinning the floor or beginning to tint the floor. That helps with your dehumidification. You can have a less area to dehumidify. Of course, if you got a gymnasium and it's 40 foot tall to the peak, you're drying. If you can tint the floor, you're drying a lot less area than you are if you're not tinting the floor. Here's a picture of a tint that's in the floor, and so you've got about probably at the peak of that 5 feet, but down where it reaches near the wall, you got 0. You better have good knee pads, because when you're adjusting all that equipment and you are going in there and doing your metering and adjusting your mats and doing all that kind of stuff, it makes it a lot more difficult. The second mistake made here that you need to try to avoid is they use black plastic on it. So it's very, very, very dark in there. You have to do artificial lighting. So if you can use the clear plastic, you're a lot better off that you can see when you get under the tent. Of course, another option to this is just to simply add more dehumidification to what you're doing and have it enough to dry that air that's up top. Now, if you're trying to add heat with the dry air, which heat is good on wood, again, makes it more difficult if you don't tint. So tinting is a good thing. Try to use clear plastic on it. And if you can start your tent at 3 or 4 feet above the wall or above the floor surface near the walls, to where you can at least have a little headroom to get over there, it makes life a little bit easier. Here's a picture where they have a tent and they have the clear in it, and you got your tube from your desk running in to start putting your dry air into there. These gym floors are designed a different way by every flooring company in the country, or every architect in the country. So you've got to get into that. You can see to the right in the center of this picture, the plywood laying sort of at a diagonal under this floor, and then another piece of plywood running the length of the floor. So 90% of the time you're going to want to use desiccant drying. With this, desiccant just creates a drier air than LGR. Also, it creates more heat. And a lot of times these big gymnasiums, when you add all this drying equipment, the system is challenged to say the best at trying to keep up with cooling anyway. And as you know, with an LGR, if you get it too warm in there, they're not going to be very effective. Anything above 90 degrees, their efficiency starts going way down. So normally this is either going to be heat drying or desiccant drying, whichever you prefer or have equipment to do. But nevertheless, a big job. You notice this plastic, the seams in the middle. There are companies out there that you just call, you tell them how big of a piece of plastic you need, and they can usually get that ready in about a day. Well, once again, you're not going to get through with this job in 3 days, because it's going to take a little bit to get a sheet of plastic that's 150 foot wide and 400 feet long, seamed together and ready for you to go pick up to be able to do your tent. So in between there, you can get your setup done of your drying systems under the floor and start to doing a lot of other prep work. Now let's get a little more difficult. Got a spring floor. Now these floors are sometimes common in ballrooms and dance rooms. They may be common in computer rooms with very, very sensitive equipment to where they don't want any vibration, or they want to minimize the vibration. Very expensive floor to install, and very, very complex floors to dry. As you can see here, you've got carpet on top, then you've got foam that is usually between 1 3/8 and 2 inches thick, and then here you've got 2 layers of plywood on this particular one, and then you've got your springing device that goes on there. So you're looking at total height on that floor of 7 1/4 inches if you use a 2-inch foam in the carpet, and that's using 3/8 plywood. If you use thicker plywood, you can get pretty close to 8 inches thick on that floor. A lot of drying to do there. That's something that's going to take a lot of discussion about how to dry, how long it's going to take. Got to have a lot of testing in that to see how deep your water penetrated, or if it went all the way through, and if you've got water trapped in the space of where the spring is and no way to extract that water. That's a huge challenge too. But you may be looking at millions of dollars to replace this floor, depending on how big it is. So it's not something you just want to go in and tell the building management people on Monday morning that you tore it out over the weekend because you couldn't get it dry. That's something that you're going to need authorizations on. Probably be some engineers involved, some hygienists involved, a lot of different things like that before you just start ripping it up. On the right of this screen, where they're doing some demolition here, you can see to where they've torn out most of the hardwood on this, looks like a gymnasium floor, and they've got 2x4 what they call sleepers, and they're just laying there. They're not nailed down to anything. They're just laying there loose, and then this plywood floor is put on top of that, and it is nailed to these sleepers as they come to it, but it creates like a floating floor system. Now, it's a good place to trap 1.5 inches of water, and you can't get to it to extract it. If you're trying to blow air from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen with all these 2x4s laying in there and the floor is still on it, that's not possible to get airflow down through there. If you're going to get airflow, you'd have to go from screen right to screen left or vice versa to get air to flow in those channels. However, your next challenge is if you look below the 2x4s that are just laying there, you'll see a vapor barrier. Now, if that's a painted-on vapor barrier, such as hot tar or some type of painted-on vapor barrier, you're in better shape than you would be without it. If that's plastic, it's usually got a lot of wrinkles in it. It's holding water. It's got water on top of it. It's got water underneath it. So how do you dry the water that's on the concrete floor underneath the plastic? It's hard to do, if not impossible to do. Would it eventually dry? Well, sure it would, but is it going to be in a timely manner that you can get this building back in order? Probably not. So in your beginning stages, you've got to know what you're drying. You've got to know how it's built. It may mean taking a little piece of the floor. It looks perfectly good up. But you got to know what you're drying and how it's built and how the water is. And sometimes you've just got to put in your reports that, in your opinion, this floor probably will not be a successful drying project because of the water trapped, and tell them why. That makes it a reason, not an excuse, but tell them what the challenges that you have to get through that would be, and why it's going to be such a challenge to dry. I've done those before. Done one in Paducah, Kentucky. Picking on Kentucky today, if anybody's in there from Kentucky. But anyway, I did one in Paducah, Kentucky for a franchise company over there. We told them on the first day it probably wouldn't dry. We did not set up any equipment. We just done an evaluation of the floor, had the equipment there, and so we called the company we were working for. We all got on a conference call with the adjuster and with the building owners and all that, and we told them, based on the way the floor was constructed, we did not think it would be a successful drying job. So the adjuster said he would make some phone calls and call back. He called back about an hour later and said, Scott, he said, this floor will cost $750,000 to replace, and it'll take about 9 to 12 weeks to get it torn out and replaced. He said, if I don't at least attempt to dry this floor, I'll get fired. So we got to try. He said, I understand what you're saying, but give it a try. So we tried for 5 days, and at the end of 5 days, and we wrote him a report every day on how it was progressing or the lack thereof. He said, okay, we tried, thank you, and then they replaced the floor. So that, you may run into some of that. So sometimes, does that seem like the right thing to do? Probably not. But we have to work with people as we're going, and when you're dealing with major jobs on commercial, again, as opposed to 1,000 houses doing 1,000 houses, you're going to get different decisions like that. This is a laminate floor over marble or tile, and that's where somebody's just don't like the tile anymore and they want to put laminate down. When you get water trapped between that, that's going to pose a lot of challenges with that as well. Watch that glue. A lot of glue has asbestos in it. More of the black glue than the white glue, but nevertheless have everything there sampled. One of the challenges you got here, if you pull that up, is getting all that glue off of the floor to an acceptable standard to put a new floor down. If you're not doing the reconstruction on that, my advice is let the floor covering company that's going to install the new floor handle that after everything's dry. If you are doing the reconstruction, my advice is still let the floor covering company that you're going to hire come in there and get that right, and that way they can know it's acceptable by their standards, not by yours. This is a glued floor over concrete, pretty much in the same thing as tile. The only difference you might have when you're dealing with the tile floor in the previous photo is you may have water between the tile and the concrete that the tile's glued to also. Create a little hollow sound there if the tile has lost its bond, but you may very well have multiple problems there. Now, if this is on regular concrete here, you've got to figure out if you've got water under it or not. If you've got water under it, again, it's a good challenge to dry, but with a good mat system, you should be able to dry it out if that's an actual wood floor. A lot of people say run a sander over a floor so it breaks the varnish to get off the moisture. If that floor is wet and any swelling in it whatsoever, even minute amounts, that will actually ruin the floor, because if you sand it off smooth and then it dries, it'll have little dips in it where where it was curled up on the edges where you sanded it off. I don't really recommend that. Seen people go over with steel wool. As long as you got cracks in the floor and you got a good mat system, you should be able to successfully dry hardwood. Now, if it's bucked up when you get there, don't ever make the promise that it won't be bucked up when you leave. You can only promise that you can dry it. You don't know how long it's going to take, and you do not know if the wood will lay back down. I tell people all the time it's usually about 50% success rate when you're dealing with hardwood. Another thing you might have in most commercial bathrooms, a lot of commercial bathrooms, you'll have sheetrock on the wall. You'll see that sheetrock on this picture is green. It's probably not because it's painted green. That's called green board. Green board is known to be water resistant or moisture resistant. Sometimes you may hear it referred to as MR board or WR board. So you put that on and then you simply glue tile to it. It makes a very beautiful wall, makes a good wall. Now that sheetrock is not waterproof. It is water resistant. They do make a waterproof sheetrock. I've seen it in one building. I've seen it in a lot of samples. I've read the stats on it. I've seen it in one building down in Miami, Florida, and it dried extremely quick because you had a little moisture behind the wall, a little moisture in front of the wall. Had to take the wallpaper off, the laminate wallpaper off. But as far as the waterproof sheetrock, it dried pretty quick. It is so expensive, you're not going to see it very often. Even when you do see it, even with waterproof sheetrock, it's still got conventional sheetrock mud and tape on it to make the seam smooth. So if that's wet, you still got to deal with that and getting that part of it dry. But if you get water trapped behind this tile, then you have a special set of challenges there. Hopefully you can do some cord drying with that, maybe drill some holes near the bottom in the grout lines, or hopefully you can dry it from the back side or something like that. But again, something you need to talk about before you just take a sledgehammer and start beating on it. Ceramic floors, a lot of discussion in the industry about ceramic tile floors, and do you dry them or do you not? Why do you dry a ceramic tile floor? Is it, if it's not, don't look damaged. I've seen drying companies go in and dry a tile floor after a water pipe went off for days and days, and they get through drying it, and the janitorial company comes in and floods it with a water hose to clean it up. And that's the way they clean it all day, every day. In restaurants, most of the time you just put a bunch of soap on the floor, you flood it with water, you scrub it with a brush. So some of these floors are designed to be wet, just as tile surrounding a swimming pool will. So get professional help if you don't have an answer on that. Get with what type of flooring it is, and make sure you're not running up a big drying bill that at the end somebody's not going to want to pay for because it wasn't necessary. So be careful about that. Here's your Quiet Walk absorbent pad. There's another product put in there. It's another place to trap water. You got a laminate flooring on top of it. If air can get in there, so can water. So just be careful and know what you're drying when you get into that Quiet Walk absorbent pad. They make that as a replacement for Gypcrete because it is cheaper to put down, and it does the same absorbent job as far as noise goes. But it is very difficult to dry when you can't get to it, when you got all that other stuff on top of it. You got to know what you're drying. Concrete floors, once again, know why you're drying it. I got called to California to help advise a franchise company out there to dry a warehouse one day. Concrete floor in a warehouse. They wanted to dry it. It's $250,000 drying job. And I have no idea yet why we dried the concrete. I have no idea. I mean, there's running forklifts up and down through there from the outside all the time, getting water on the floor. But they wanted this concrete dry. So $250,000 later, concrete was dry. Sometimes you'll have people ask you to do weird things and you don't even know the reason. Don't get yourself in the trap of doing it and try to give an excuse later why you done it. You need to give the reason up front if you're the one making the decision on it. If you are drying concrete to put a floor covering back on, by all means you do have to make sure that's dry, because it will damage the floor covering. If you still have moisture under that floor, you'll either have mold on the back side of the floor covering and the glue, or you'll have the floor to warp, and the warranty from the manufacturer will not stand behind that. So that could go from becoming the insurance company's and the building owner's problem to be your problem if you tell them the floor is at acceptable standards and it's not. I recommend always letting the floor covering company that's going to do the reinstall come out and making that decision, and obviously in writing. Talked to you a while ago about a hydronic drying system. That's what these blue tubes are in here. You see they've got rebar in here. They've got a bottom concrete layer, but they got this one on top of crushed rock, which is probably your bottom layer. And then you've got insulation there. That insulation holds the heat from going down and makes all the heat go up. And then you pour one layer of concrete, put your rebar in there, and then you tie your hydronic heating to that. Now, they put this system in before the walls are built. And the tricky part to that is they don't do room by room by room. So you can't just go in there and tear out one room, because these tubes likely run from one end of the house to the other end of the house throughout this floor. Sometimes they'll put them in chambers or segments, but it's not going to be room by room. They're going to be spread out a little bit. So you got to be really careful about puncturing that tube in any way. But before you recommend tearing out a lightweight concrete floor that these tubes are in, once again, you got to know what you're drying. You got to know how you're drying, and you got to give them the reason for tearing that out, not the excuse of why you tore up this entire hydronic heating system in the entire house. Because now you're not dealing with two rooms that are wet. In this commercial building, you may be dealing with a big, lot larger area, and someone would want repayment for that. So know what you're drying before you get into destructive drying. Bamboo, very popular in high-end commercial. It does have its difficulties of drying. It's not that bad. It's more related, as I've been going over this morning, to what's under it than it is the wood itself. Obviously, by looking at that from across the street running 55 miles an hour down the road, that's a laminate, and not anything you can do with that except figure out what's under it and how much of it you got to take out. So, carpet, that's pretty easy. Again, you know, drying carpet's easy. If you're on this group, you've already elevated past that, and you know how easy that is. The part that you don't know is what is under that carpeting. Here is a picture of hardwood that is under the carpeting that became popular back several years ago. People would just take these hardwood floors because it had a stain on it, usually pet urine stain, or maybe it had some cracking or peeling in it, and I'll just cover it up with carpet. It's cheap, it's quick, and it got a perfect floor under it. But then you got the hardwood. Now you've got another subfloor over that hardwood. I'm talking about picture on the right now, by the way. And so you've got, carpet pad, hardwood, and something under that. Or maybe you had vinyl in between there. I can't stress enough, you've got to know what you're drying. You've got to slow down. You've got to go through there and figure out what you're drying and how you're drying it and what you got to do with that. Now today, people are more prone to take the carpet up, and they don't care about the stains. It adds character to the building. On the left of that screen, you see hardwood flooring over the top of carpet. That is not very common to see. Some people do it for sound deadening. That's sort of like the foam that you would put under there, and it makes the floor float a little bit. Most of the time that's a snap together floor, but you will see that some on a tight flooring. But again, until you get up under there and know what's under that, and you know what the what's under the carpet and what's under the floor, then you really are not going to be able to put together a good drying plan. All right, here's a floor called a mixed floor in this photo, but you got wood, and I'm sure that's probably an expensive type of wood. Then you got inlays of ceramic or some other materials. Probably not ceramics, probably more like corian or slate or something like that. This mix in there. Very delicate floor to dry. Very beautiful, as you can see. That's not a floor that they're going to want to just come in and say, oh, we can't dry that. They're going to want to do a little testing and drying on that, and to see what is the best drying plan to do that. Let's talk about a drying plan for a minute. Don't have a slide up there on that, but if you have any reference to the ICRC or making a reference, and that's how you're going to dry and this, that, and the other, the ICRC says you must have a drying plan before you start drying. Now, that drying plan don't mean you walk in there and say, hey, get some air movers and D's. You're supposed to have a written plan on exactly what you're going to do. And that should be part of your scope of work. Now, if you don't have a drying plan on one of those 1,000 houses I spoke about earlier, and you get called out on that, and it may cost you a few dollars, it's not a big deal. But if you dry 7 floors of a building without a drying plan, and then all of a sudden the armchair quarterback comes in and says, well, we're not paying for that. We don't think all that was necessary. Because, if we'd have known you were going to dry it like that, we would have just tore it out. But you didn't have a drying plan submitted, so we didn't know what you were going to do. So don't get caught up in that drying plan thing. You have to have a written drying plan. So sometimes, as they say in NASCAR, you got to slow down to speed up. So when you get there, slow down a little bit, take a little bit of time, quit hollering and screaming, I got to have equipment set in 30 minutes. Scope your job, put together a good drying plan, make sure it's communicated, and let's get started drying. Another type of floor that's a mixed floor. You got hardwood and tile here. Very beautiful floors, more challenging to dry. So here is a picture of the gyp floor they put down. In this one, they're putting it down before they put the sheetrock in. That's I'm not going to say it's uncommon, but you'll see it put in a lot of times after the sheetrock's in. You just pour this on the floor, and then it's sort of self-leveling. You can see how liquid that is. So it sort of self-levels itself. It is a real soft material, so if they get a wrinkle or hump in it, they just simply sand it out and get the floor down smooth before they put the floor covering on it. So it's an excellent way to make a smooth floor. And a lot of times what you'll see, and you need to listen to this really well because you might buy the problem if you don't, but a lot of times what you'll see is that plywood that guy's standing on in this 5-story building got wet 67 times during the construction of the building. And this floor is all warped up. And there's just no way possible to put a smooth floor surface on that warped up floor. So then they will install the gypsum flooring, lightweight concrete, whichever terminology they use, to cover that up. Well, you have water damage in this thing, and it's your job to dry it, and you don't discover that that flooring is already warped and dirty and gray looking and moldy and everything else. You could be called to task later on to explain why you didn't dry that plywood right, and why now it's becoming rotten and causing a big problem when it actually wasn't your problem in the first place. You simply didn't do a good job of inspecting the building. So make sure you keep that in mind. You'll have the uneducated adjuster, and that's not being derogatory, it's just saying they don't have education in the system, but I think that's also referred to as ignorance of the situation, but that sounds a little more derogatory. But hey, you put this in wet, so the plywood's wet when you put it in, so I know it's wet with water now. What's the difference? It dried then, it'll dry now. Well, the difference is this drying is a chemical process. It's not a process of it drying from having water on it. There's not going to be a chemical process once this dries out and then you interject new water into it down the road. But during the chemical process of this is what dries the water from the mixtures of the lightweight concrete itself. Some another picture of some foam between the joist, and then plywood, and then hydronic heating and different types of a poured slab on top of it. And then you might have tile on top of that. Can you dry a tile floor on top of that? Maybe, maybe not. It depends. Put together a drying plan. There are classes that teach drilling holes into the grout and putting the mat system on it and pulling air up through that. I hear they have some pretty good success with that. I always worry about putting the grout back in, but if the regrouting job is done good, that may not be an issue, but it depends on the floor and depends on the surface underneath. Like I say, we get tied up too much on the surface of the floor, and can we dry that, when in most cases we should be worrying about drying what's underneath that floor. Just another picture of your hydronic heat, and they're over there coating it with the lightweight concrete and covering that up and getting that ready to receive a floor covering. Now you see the wall on the left side over here is plywood, and now they're pouring gypcrete. They're pouring at least an inch, I'd say an inch and a half thick, to cover the rebar in those tubes. So you're going to have that plywood trapped between that stud wall that's behind it and that floor in there. So if all that gets good and wet and you were to need to remove that plywood, you can see that the challenge that creates there. So that may be some more of those extended drying times to keep from doing a lot of damage, and we need to give them the reason before we have the extended drying times, not the excuse after the fact. Talking a lot about floors today because that's what we dry the most, but we're talking a lot here about you got another ceramic tile on top of various building materials here, and they're making all types of new materials every day, all day. So again, get with the flooring manufacturer, figure out who that is, take pictures of it, get with people who can help you put together a drying plan when you get something like that. If this waffle pad, what appears to be a waffle pad, there is actually a hard plastic. Comes in rolls most of the time, and I don't know the science behind it, but I know the hard plastic, once you put the mud down to put the tile on, it keeps that tile from cracking. You see it put in motor coaches a lot, because motor coaches are going down the road and they're twisting and turning, but you put that hard plastic under there, and that creates a really strong bond between all that, and it will not basically will not crack due to movement like that. But if you get water under that hard plastic, drying it's going to be a challenge. You're going to have to dry it from underneath, basically, in most cases. Again, get with the manufacturer, put together a drying plan. Bowling alleys. boy, oh boy, what a challenge. No, definitely not one of your 1,000 houses that you're going to dry. Some of the biggest challenges you'll have in life is drying a bowling alley. Lot of different technology into these bowling alleys, growing every day. The surface of that floor you're seeing is the very least of your problems. You've got areas of channels under there where the balls roll. You've probably got 3 or 4 feet of access beneath the floor to where the electronics go in. It's definitely going to be on a springboard system or some sort of cushioned system to hold that floor up and to make it quieter and more resilient when those balls are slamming up against the floor. You definitely need a bowling alley expert on your consulting team, on day 2 or 3 of this job. Of course, water extraction starts from dehumidification. That kind of stuff's always okay to go ahead and get started, and don't wait till you get all that done and then call a consultant. You pretty much call a consultant as soon as you look at the floor and figure out it's pretty wet. Get someone in there that designs those things to help you, preferably the person who installed it. You can see here the big voids we're talking about that are in there. Look at all that framing in there. Now, if you've got all that wet, that's a challenge. If that wood swells and that floor moves a 1/4 of an inch, that bowling ball not going to roll in the right direction. So you got lots of challenges when you get into these bowling alleys. So get some good help in there. Get some people that's done it. Get some engineers in there and make these little things called airplanes so they can fly in from all over the country to come help you with this. So don't be afraid. There's not one in your town. You're talking thousands and thousands, and if not millions of dollars when you get into these bowling alleys. So don't bite off something that you can't chew. Tunnels. When we look at some buildings, you may be drying the tunnels in a building, and the building never got wet. The high school that Michael Jordan played basketball at in Chicago has a lot of tunnels under it. The tunnels house the heating and air conditioning pipes, much like hydronic. It boils water or glycol. It runs through the pipes, but then in the olden days, they ran into radiators in the classroom, and the radiators just radiated heat from this boiling water running through them all the time. So instead of going through the floor, so those tunnels, when they get wet, when those tunnels get wet and have a lot of moisture in them, they're like a big chimney. And when air comes through those tunnels, it's carrying this damp, moist, wet air through those tunnels and then back up to wherever the end of the tunnel comes from. So you're getting a big, musky, damp, muddy, moldy smell coming up into the building because these tunnels are wet. So you've got to, a lot of times you'll dry a tunnel when you're not drying anything else. As you can see, the tunnels a lot of times are high. You can walk through them. They've got a lot of stuff in them. Look at both pictures where the piping is. A lot of times those are wrapped with insulation, and if that's sort of an old building, then that may be asbestos insulation that's on there. So be careful with what you're drying, even though you're drying in a tunnel. So put together a drying plan, a lot of electronics, a lot of electricity, a lot of stuff in these tunnels. They're nasty, they're muddy, some of them have dirt floors in them instead of concrete floors. Very few of them are as clean as the one you see in the circle on the left. Most of them look more like the one on the right or even worse. When you're drying a building and you think, I got it all dry, but we're still smelling the smell. The first one of these I bumped into, I don't mind telling you, I was ignorant of the fact, Fort Wayne, Indiana. We didn't even know it had tunnels under it for the first 10 or 12 days we were drying the building. And then somebody discovered the tunnels. Well, it cost more to dry the tunnels than it did to dry the buildings, but it took us 10 days before we started looking. So always keep that in mind. Learn off my mistake. I got away with it, by the way, but learn off my mistake and look for these tunnels in buildings. You never know where they're at and where they're leading to and how much junk they got in them. Data floors, very common where you have lots of data room. We just helped a gentleman in Wisconsin draw a data room building. The building was 3 football fields long and 2 football fields wide, and every single inch of it looked exactly like what you're staring at in that picture. Just cabinets after cabinets after cabinets full of computer servers or whatever they use to run the internet with. And again, 3 football fields long and 2 wide. It was just enormous, but they're on these data floors that are designed to hold the weight, number one, withstand the heat, because those computers put out enormous amounts of heat, and they got to be perfectly level for whatever reason. So it's not something they just come in and sit on concrete. Underneath the data floor is the biggest room. Is where do you run all those cables? Well, you run all those cables under the floor. And your maintenance people or your electronics people, or if you got to add a cable or take a cable away or move a cable, they simply take a suction cup and they go to whatever panel they want to take out of the floor, and they pick that panel up and set it aside. And then they can get under the floor to run new cables. That's why the floors are so popular. It's a lot easier, neater, and cleaner than trying to run them overhead. Obviously, unless that channel under that floor is full of water, and then you can take that neater and cleaner out of there, because now they're soaked with water, and so are all those cables. Now, some of the cables may not be hurt by water, some of them may be, but at any rate, that's a lot of drying to do. Be sure not to be drying a commercial building and figure out 3 or 4 days later that, this is on the data floor. You need to figure that out during your initial assessment. Elevator shafts, always a challenge. Recommend you have the elevator company come out and raise the shaft and lock the doors off where you can get in there. If we have to have someone go in a shaft, we make sure the elevator company is on site and they have it locked off. Last thing you want is an elevator car running down to the first floor and squishing the people that are in the first floor trying to get water out of the shaft. So we want the elevator company there. We don't want Tom, Dick, or Harry, or Sally, or Jane, saying, I'll stand here and watch it and make sure it don't go down. These elevator companies actually have security locks they put on these things that even if the electronic system fails, it physically cannot go down. Be real careful with elevator shafts when you're trying to get into those. Yes, it may take a day or 2 more, but get the elevator company there. They have emergency service calls at elevator companies because people sometimes get stuck in the elevator, and the fire department can get them out. They might not can, but sometimes you have to call the elevator company. Let's talk about the elevator shafts itself. Should they get wet from particularly overhead, and now you're dealing with multiple layers of or floors of the shaft, not just one where water ran into the shaft and went straight down. These shafts, by code, design, and safety standards, have to be fire rated. And most of them have to have at least a 2-hour fire rating on them. Now, overwhelmingly, most of them are either concrete or concrete block. And so we don't get too concerned about them being wet unless the concrete block cores are full of water. We do need to check for that if the water came from overhead. However, in some areas, Louisiana being one of them, I assisted on an 8-story hotel down there, and the shaft was fireproof by 4 layers of 5/8 inch fireproof sheetrock, and it was soaking wet down all 8 floors. How do you dry 4 layers of laminated sheetrock smushed together? How do you get that dry? Don't want to close the whole hotel down. I mean, you're talking thousands and hundreds of thousands of missed revenue to close the hotel down to dry the elevator shaft. So how do you dry that? So you have to put together a drying plan. You have to get with the hotel management. You have to get with the adjusting teams. You have to get with the engineers, and you got to put together a drying plan to figure out how to dry that. So we did dried it successfully, and then we put together a monitoring system to monitor it for the next year to make sure that no problems reared its ugly head in there. So we had everybody sign off on the program. So be careful when you're dealing with elevator shafts. Escalators, not much sheetrock under escalators at all, but they do have big holes under them where all the gears and the steps work. Some of the nastiest areas you'll work in, because everything that everybody drops gets rolled right down into there. So make sure you have safeguards up anytime you're working on the escalators. Make sure you have an electrician or an escalator company there. That's not something your technician is going to have training in. They go down there and they're wiping the water off something, and they hit the switch and that escalator starts to roll again, and they're up under there. It could cause a catastrophic problem. So you want an escalator company to come out and handle 90% of this project and to assist you on handling the other 10% of it. Dance floors built all different ways. Some of them's got lights in them down in the floors. A lot of times they'll look sort of like those computer floors we showed earlier, but their panels may have lights around the edges and all to light up a floor. They've been on springboards. They're designed to hold an immense amount of weight, so there are lots of bracing under it, just like it was in that other floor. So, and the surface of them are extremely hard to keep the heels of the ladies' shoes from piercing into them. So, again, get with the professionals that put the floor in, or somebody that knows about them, and put together a good drying plan. Showing a little bit of your load distribution and layers and your vapor barriers. It's just a lot more bracing in those than you would see in a normal floor when you get into those type of floors. So, we talked a lot about floors today. I've never seen a wet building. Well, I won't say never. Very seldom see a wet building don't have a wet floor. Floors are usually the most difficult part to dry, but the surface that you see is not what makes it difficult. It's what you don't see. And way too many times people go in there and start biting that bullet, and then don't know what they're drying. And then they don't understand why they can't get it dry. And then we start making excuses. If we do the proper evaluation with the proper professionals up front, you can give them a reason up front, and that will delay the project, but that usually means the longer the project runs, the higher dollar value of the job, and you don't want that to become your problem when it should be theirs. Thank you for your attendance today. I am Scott Tarpley.